Hi everyone and welcome to the video presentation for module number 14. This video presents more non-chord tones. And so we'll review what a non-chord tone is, and then we'll talk about the appoggiatura, the escape tone, the neighbor group, the anticipation, and the pedal point. Okay, so as you remember, non-chord tones are just notes that occur during a chord but are not actually notes of that chord, so notes that do not belong. So in a triad, right, you have a root, a third, and a fifth. A non-chord tone would be any of those notes, any note that is not one of those three parts. Okay, and they're special because they're dissonant, and just like we've seen with counterpoint and stuff like that, they have to be handled with care and they have to be identified correctly. Okay, and it may not have been super clear last time, but different non-chord tones are defined by how they are created, either by a step or a leap, and the direction that they go. So something like a passing tone is a passing tone because you step to it to create it, but then you step away from it to a new note to resolve it. So that makes it a passing tone. A neighbor tone also moves by step, right? You step up and then you step back down. So those are both, or you step down and step back up. So those are both defined by a step. That's not the only way to create non-chord tones, but that is that's what defines passing tone and neighbor tones as those types of non-chord tones. Okay, so let's talk about some more of these. The first one is called an appoggiatura. An appoggiatura is a non-chord tone that is created by a leap up or down and then left by a step in the opposite direction. So with all these, I'm going to show you an example and then we'll work on how to identify where they are. And I'll give you different kinds of textures and different types of music to look at this time too. So this one's similar to a 4-part chorale format, and in here somewhere is an ascending appoggiatura. So let's listen. Okay, so we have to find the non-chord tone, and the first thing you need to do to find the non-chord tone is figure out what the chords are. And in this texture, it's pretty obvious. It's just like our 4-part chorale. So this is the key of F. This first chord is an F major triad, so that's a 1 chord. The second chord is a D minor triad, so that's a 6 chord. And this last chord over here is a G minor triad, so that's a 2 chord. So we have 1, 6, 2, no inversions. So let's see if there's any non-chord tones in this first one. We have an F, a C, an F, and an A, so no. In the second chord, we have a D, an F, and an E. And so if this is a D minor triad, that should only have a D, an F natural, and an A. And the A can sometimes be missing because it's okay to not have the fifth. So this E that happens on this chord is a note that is not a chord tone. So that's a non-chord tone, okay? And if we look at it, we see that we create that non-chord tone by leaping to it, just like an appoggiatura. So we leap up to it, and then we leave it by a step in the opposite direction. So we're leaping to create this appoggiatura, I'll abbreviate it APP, and then we're stepping down to resolve it to a non-chord tone. And that's what makes it an appoggiatura. All right, so let's look at another example. Now this one is not in a nice little 4-part thing like before. It's a little bit more like a piano texture maybe, so it might be a little bit more difficult to hear the chords, but in here somewhere is a descending appoggiatura. So let's listen to this one. Okay, so somewhere in there is a descending appoggiatura. And again, to analyze this, we need to find the non-chord tone, we need to analyze the chords. So we want to look at where we think the chords happen. All right? Now they don't happen all at once like over in our chorale texture. Now they kind of are broken up. So in this case, you have to kind of consider everything that happens, and it's usually indicated by the bass, everything that happens sort of in how fast the chords are moving. So you can see here we have an F and an A on a downbeat, and then we have an A and a C. So that's all kind of part of one chord, right? F, A, C, that's an F major chord. So this is a 1 chord, again, in the key of F. Okay. And over here, if we look at all the notes, we have a D, an A, another D, an E, and an F. Well, that E doesn't really belong, but if we consider the D, the F, the A, and the D, again, that's our sixth harmony, just like before. And over here we have a G, a B flat, and a D, and that makes a G minor chord, which is our 2. And so you can see, even though they're not happening exactly at the same time, they still all create a single chord. All right. So then, where is our non-chord tone? Well, again, it happens in this sixth chord. So the sixth chord should be D, F, and A D minor triad, and we get this note E that does not belong. And that note E is a non-chord tone that's created by a leap down. So we leap down from the A to the E, and then we step up. So it leaps down and then steps up, which is the opposite direction. So again, this is an appoggiatura. This time we call it a descending appoggiatura. Okay, let's move on to another one. Okay, the next one is called an escape tone, which is a little bit like the opposite of an appoggiatura. Escape tone is a non-chord tone that is created by a step up or down and then left by a leap in the opposite direction. So this time we're stepping up and then leaping away from it. All right, so here's an example. Here are 2 escape tones here. Now they can go any direction. These both happen to be going the same direction. But in this example are 2 escape tones. And you can see it's a little bit of different texture from before too. So let's listen to this one. One more time. Okay. And so again, you have to be able to analyze the chords to figure out where the chords are. Now in something like this, we have to again kind of compress all the notes together to figure out where the chords are. They don't all kind of happen one chord, one chord, one chord, right? They're spread out. And so you can kind of see that in the way that this 16th note thing happens, right? So here we have an A. If I consider all these notes to be part of one chord, which they are, we have an A, a C sharp, and an E. And in the key of A major, right? That A major triad is the 1 chord. So for this beat, even though the notes are all spread out, we hear them as being part of one thing. So that is a 1 chord there. Now here, in this next beat, we have, again, considering these all part of one note, or one chord, a G sharp, a B, and an E. Okay? Well, G sharp B E is like a 5/6 chord because that's an E major chord with a G sharp on the bottom. So that's first inversion, so that's a 5/6. Over here, again, we have just a triad that's all spread out. So we have F sharp, A, and C sharp. So that's going to be a 6 chord, an F sharp minor chord in the key of A. So this is our chord progression, 1, 5, 6, 6. And again, even though the notes don't all happen at once, right? They're not a block chord like this, right? We still have that sound of a triad even though it's broken up. Because we hear them together. Okay, so now we know that our chords are 1, 5, 6, and 6. So now we need to try to find our non-chord tones. Okay, well, let's look at the melody now because these can be in any part of the music. So here, this E in our melody is the 5th of this 1 chord. This F sharp, though, does not belong in this A major triad. So that is not a chord tone. That's a non-chord tone. And we'll see that it's created by stepping up to an F sharp, right? So we step up, and then it looks like we leap away from it, and we leap to the note B, which is part of the next chord. So this is an escape tone. Okay, and then over here, same thing, that B is part of the 5/6 chord, but this C sharp does not belong in that chord. So that C sharp, again, is we create it by going up a step and then leaping away from it. So again, that's another escape tone. So 2 escape tones here. let's look at another kind of non-chord tone. This is called a neighbor group. We've also seen this before as a double neighbor. It's basically the same thing. So it's two non-chord tones in a row that are a step above and below a single chord tone. So a bit like a neighbor, but we're going to both of our neighbors, not just one of them. All right. So in here we have a double neighbor tone somewhere. So let's listen to this example. One more time. Okay. Now again, this is more of a piano-like texture, or maybe like a melody and accompaniment texture, something like that. But we don't have one chord after another. So we kind of have to take all this information and figure out what the chord progression is based on everything that's here. Okay. And so we see that it ends on a chord that's E, G, and E, right? Because this bottom staff is treble clef. E, G, and E. So even though there's no B there, this kind of is probably an E minor chord. So I'd say we're in the key of E minor. Okay. So that's going to be our one chord. If we back up from there, we have this happening, a B and an A, which isn't really a chord because there's no third in there, right? But if we look at the melody, because the melody has notes too, right? We do have a D sharp on that downbeat and another D sharp later. These other ones we'll have to figure out. But if we imagine that that D sharp is actually part of this chord, which it is, then our chord is B, D sharp, A, which is a 5/7 without its fifth in the key of E minor. So that's probably that chord. Okay. Now this next one, there's actually a couple different ways we could look at it, but if we just look at this C and this A as being part of the chord, then this could maybe be a 4 chord, but without its fifth, right? It could also be a 2 chord, 2 diminished chord without its root, I guess, right? So either of those are possible. Now, if we look at the melody, we'll see that we have that F sharp that would make it a 2 chord, and we have the E that would make it a 4 chord. So it really could be either. But for now, we'll just say that and we'll figure it out in a second. Now, this first one has no fifth or anything, but since we're in the key of E minor, I think it's likely that this is a 1 chord. Okay. So let's figure out where this neighbor tone is first, and then we'll figure out what's going on with this chord. But in this 5/7 chord, right, we have a D sharp, which is part of the chord. We have an E, which is not part of the 5/7 chord, so that's going to be some kind of non-chord tone. And then we have a C sharp, which is also not part of the chord, right? And you'll see that they all surround this note D sharp. So since we're surrounding that note D sharp, we're going above and then below it. We call this a double neighbor tone or neighbor group. Double neighbor tone, whatever you want to call it. Okay. So that is our double neighbor tone. Now let's talk about this second chord here. So like I said, you could analyze this in 2 different ways, which is part of the trouble with doing non-chord tones. And, you know, this happens all the time in music. Sometimes it's not exactly clear. So if we consider that F sharp to be a chord tone, right? So let's say that F sharp is a chord tone, then this chord would be a 2 diminished in, what would that be? Second inversion. And then this E would be a passing tone. So that's one way to analyze that. Another way to analyze it would be to consider that E as the chord tone, right? In which case this would be a 4 chord, and that F sharp would be a passing tone, right? So either way is correct. There's no real right answer to that, since that's, you know, not obvious in the left hand of this piano part what the chord actually is. So either of those is the correct answer, right? And sometimes with music, there is no one right answer. There are multiple right answers. So that one there could be a 4 chord or a 2 diminished chord, depending on which one of those notes in the melody you consider to be a non-chord tone. Okay, nice little example there. Now let's look at another kind of non-chord tone called the anticipation. Anticipations are non-chord tones that are created by moving early to a note of the next chord. Okay, and so these happen when you anticipate, you move early to a note that belongs in the chord that's coming up, but does not belong in the chord that you're currently on. So we have an example of that in this little piano piece. So let me play this for you and we'll go find it. Okay, so somewhere in there is a anticipation. So again, we have to kind of figure out what the chords are first before we can figure out where our non-chord tones are. So this is in the key of B flat major. Let's figure out this first chord. We have an E flat, an F, and an A. And if we look at the melody, we also have an F. All right. So E flat, F, A, to me, is like a 5, 4, 2. So in the key of B flat, right, the 5 chord would be an F chord, F, A, C, E flat, right? If it's a 7, we'd add the 7th, which is E flat. So that would be 5, 7. But we're putting that 7th, that E flat, in the bass. So that makes this a 5, 4, 2. Okay. Now, we know it's that and not a maybe a 7 chord, right? Because if we look at how this repeats, it's E flat, A, F, A, and then again, E flat, A, F, A. And so whenever things repeat, that means that you have the same chord for both of those beats, all right? And so that means we have all those notes plus what's in the melody, so that F and then the C are all part of the chord. So that makes this an F7 chord in 4/2 position, all right? Now over here we have a D, a B flat, and an F, and then again a D, a B flat, and an F. So this all belongs in one chord for those 2 beats. And so for this one, that's a B flat chord in first inversion. So that's going to be a 1, 6 for both of those beats. Over here we have E flat, C, G, C, and then it doesn't look like it repeats, but if we look at the next little figure here, I have C, G, E flat, G. So all together, if I just kind of listed the notes here, I see that I have an E flat, a C, a G. Then when I get over here, I have another C, I already have that in my list, right? Another G, I already have that in my list, and another E flat, I already have that in my list. So that means, since we're not adding any different notes, we're not changing notes, that we are actually staying on the same chord. We're just doing it in 2 different inversions, okay? So that chord, C, E flat, G, is going to be a C minor chord, which in the key of B flat major is a 2 chord. And right here where E flat's in the bass, that's a 2, 6. Then when the C becomes the bass note, we move to a 2, 6, or I'm sorry, just a 2 with no inversion, right? That's a root position 2. And then finally at the end, I have F, C, A, C, which is our 5 chord again. And then at the end, I end on a B flat. And if I look at my soprano, my melody, I have a D, which implies a 1 chord. And so if you notice, I really just kind of looked at the bass, and that's kind of what happens with this kind of music is most of the chord information is in the left hand of the piano. So whenever you have a texture like this, the best way to look at it is to look for repetitions and then consider all of those notes to be part of the chord. Okay, so let's find our non-chord tone. So here we have a 5, 4, 2. So let's check our melody. We have an F that belongs in the chord. We have a C that belongs in the chord. This note D, right, should not be in this F7 chord because the F7 chord is only F, A, C, E flat. That D instead is a note of our next chord, 1, 6, which is a B flat chord. So we're going to that D early. And whenever you go to a note early, before you're supposed to get there, we call that an anticipation. So that's our anticipation there. Right, gets to that chord tone, that D, early. Now in the rest of this, we have some other non-chord tones. So if we looked at this 2/6, right, we'll see that we have a scale. And whenever you have a scale over a chord, that usually means, or always means, that there's going to be some kind of non-chord tone in there. And there'll usually be neighbor tones or passing tones because those are the ones created by step, right? So this chord, just to remind you, this 2/6 is a C minor chord. So that means we should only have a C, an E flat, and a G. So the C on the melody, right, is fine. This B natural, though, is not part of our chord. So that's a non-chord tone. So we'll just put a parentheses around it. C is okay. D, non-chord tone, doesn't belong. E flat belongs. D again, non-chord tone, doesn't belong. E flat is okay, and F is a non-chord tone, does not belong. So we have all these non-chord tones. So what are they? Well, from C to B to C, right? We're starting on a note, going down to a new note, and then back up. That is a neighbor tone, right? Whenever we go next door and come back. And specifically, that's called a chromatic neighbor tone because that B natural also doesn't belong in the scale, right? And then we have this note D, and this note D passes in between a C and an E, so that's a passing tone. Then here we have E flat to D, that's another neighbor tone. This time it's diatonic. And then that F passes between E flat and G, so that's going to be a passing tone. Okay, now let's look at this next one here. So we have a 5 chord, right? A 5 chord should be F, A, C. So this note G actually doesn't belong, right? And so we have to figure out what we want to call that. And if we look at it, it's created by a step, but then it leaps. So whenever something is created by a step and then leaps, that's called an escape tone. Then that leaps to a C, which is part of the chord. This D is not part of the chord, right? That's a passing tone. And then this E flat could be part of the chord if we consider this to be an F7 chord, right? Otherwise, it'll be a neighbor tone. And I think both analyses are correct. So there you go. Those are all the non-chord tones. And you can see you have to know what chord you're looking at before you can find those non-chord tones. And in music like this, where the chords all spread out, you have to consider everything within, as many times as it's repeated as being part of the chord. Okay, then we have one more to look at, and this one is fairly straightforward. That's called the pedal point. A pedal point is a special non-chord tone that is not created by moving to a note outside of the chord. So you don't actually move anywhere to create this, or you don't actually resolve it either. Instead, they occur when one of the voices, almost always the bass, sustains or repeats a note while the chords change around it. Now, we've actually already learned about this when we talked about 1/6/4 chords, right? Or 6/4 chords, because we had something called a pedal 6/4, and that's exactly what they're used for. So here is a pedal point. And you can hear I'm just repeating that bass note. And whenever you repeat something over and over again while the other chords change, it's called a pedal point. So if we looked at this first chord, first we want to know that we're in C minor. This is a C minor chord, so that's a 1. All those notes belong in a C minor chord because we have a C, a G, an E flat, and that's it. And all those notes belong. This next one is a 4 chord. And again, 4 chord is an F minor chord, so that C belongs, that A flat belongs, the F belongs, A flat, C, those all belong in the chord. Over here, if we look at the right hand, we have D, G, B natural, which is a 5 chord. But we have the note C in the bass. So that's what makes this a pedal, because that's created by just repeating this C over and over again. And you can see in the first 2 chords, it's actually not a non-chord tone, but it's used like one, right? It's used as a pedal point. So pedal point is something that is sort of independent of being a non-chord tone, but also can be a non-chord tone as well. So listen to this one more time. Okay, so there you go. Those are all the new non-chord tones and some different textures to think about, because we need to be aware that not all music is in our nice little 4-part chorales. So use those ideas when you're doing your homework. Okay, well, we'll be talking about this more in our session, and I hope you all have a great day.